Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the forgeman he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
عاشبني ويجاهد عاش بكفاحه الخالد عاشبني ويجاهد عاش بكفاحه الخالد راجل واحد مبدأ واحد
عاش يصورنا
عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد حرار عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد حرار وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية
وسمعنا بيقولها
خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجند العربي عاش.
عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عينيه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عينيه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. وسمعناه بيقولها قوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش فلاح الثورة عاش.
عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. واسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
واسمعنا بيقولها هوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
قلبي وروحي ملك الفني والاتنين لبلادي هدية. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الفن رسالة عاش.
عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار، فيها مداخل طالع منها لهب النور والنار. عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار، فيها مداخل طالع منها لهب النور والنار. واسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده إنتاجي وصنع ايديا.
واسمعنا بيقولها هوية ده إنتاجي وصنع يديا.
حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايد صدرناه. حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايد صدرناه. قولوا معايا حيوا معايا
عاش عاش العامل عاش.
Good afternoon, everybody, or good evening, or good morning, depending upon where you are in the world. Perhaps you're on the other side of the world and have already seen 2024 arrive, in which case, let us know how it goes so far. Now, I will begin by paying tribute to a man whose life has just ended, unfortunately, at the age of 84 years. And that is, of course, the now, we must say, late, great John Pilger, who was an Australian by birth, journalist who worked for many years for the Daily Mirror in Britain. In fact, that's where he made his name as a reporter and sometimes columnist. And he achieved international recognition for his many documentaries, particularly in the 1970s on the Vietnam War and on Cambodia. He later went on to cover the Reagan regime's war on Nicaragua and other Central American states. He covered the Palestine issue for many, many years, making a number of absolutely crucial documentaries which everybody should watch and be aware of. He also did documentaries on domestic life in Britain, which is an aspect of his reporting which is often overlooked given the historic nature of his reporting on international affairs. And he is, or was, a man without whose influence I probably wouldn't be sitting where I am today. And by that I mean, when I was 17 years old, all the way back in 1999, I bought the book of his entitled Hidden Agendas, which was one of a series of books he wrote I believe this one was written in the 90s. And it was a book that covered a lot of his international reporting. He covered the Burmese situation extensively in that book. But it's a book that also covered domestic affairs with regard to Britain. And there's a chapter in there that deals with a lot of this stuff that if you've seen any material that we've produced from the Class Conscience Project, you'll see that Pilger might not have called himself a Marxist-Leninist, but it was, for all practical intents and purposes, he shared many of our critiques, and including that of the labor aristocracy. And I remember in this chapter in Hidden Agendas how he covered the aristocracy of labor and its inevitable betrayals. And he did so in a very clear and easy to understand fashion. And that's an analysis that has always stuck with me, as did his very comprehensive, but again, very easy to read, very easy to understand analysis in that book, Hidden Agendas, of what we'd call the bourgeois press, which of course he worked for decades. And he covered, in a semi-autobiographical nature, the nature of the old Daily Mirror that he worked for years, and also the nature of the British printed press, the British printed bourgeois press. He gave us a potted history, shall we say, of the Murdoch Empire and the Sun newspaper, how the Sun newspaper started its existence way back over 100 years ago as the TUC, Trade Union Congress's daily newspaper, the Daily Herald. And he gave, John Pilger did in this book, a great explanation as to the economics of the news business, or the newspaper business, I should say, and why it was that the British bourgeois so effectively controlled the press, and why the attempts by the TUC and the Labour Party and the British left to compete in some way with the iron grip that the bourgeois had over the news creation and management process always ended in failure. He gave the examples of like how the Daily Herald could never meet its printing costs, because to actually meet the costs of printing a daily newspaper, it took a hell of a lot of advertisers, and no advertiser would go near a daily paper that was essentially, even in the flawed way that the TUC did, preaching some form of class-based politics. And so the bourgeois, even though of course they didn't suppress the Daily Herald, not directly, they suppressed it because the cost of printing and distributing a daily newspaper is prohibitively expensive, even for a trade union federation. So much, it got so bad that the Daily Herald had to be printed on like rolls of discarded wallpaper at one stage. So it changed shape. The paper it was printed on changed quality and consistency. And all of this he outlined in this book. And ultimately the Daily Herald got bought out first by the IPC, the publisher of the old publisher of the Daily Mirror. It got relabeled as the Sun, and then the Sun was bought off IPC by a certain ambitious young media baron named Rupert Murdoch, and turned into the disgusting bog roll that it's been ever since. So the Daily Herald, this newspaper that was meant to be the daily paper of the working man, was essentially run out of business by the bourgeoisie, bought up by them, retitled, and then of course bought by Murdoch and relaunched into the most virulent anti-working class newspaper you could possibly imagine. And that, in essence, is the story of the attempts to organize in working class politics via the system, or attempts to engage on equal terms with the bourgeois in their media sphere, or to use the old Jürgen Habermas term, the public sphere. All of that always ends in failure. They can always price you out. They can always financially outmuscle you. They can always drive your projects into the ground. And that's exactly what happened with the Daily Herald, all spelt out by Pilger very vividly in a couple of chapters of his book. He also dealt with other fascinating things, such as he covered the attempt by the owner of the Daily Mirror at the time, a man named Cecil Harmsworth King. Cecil Harmsworth King was, of course, related to the Northcliffe family, Alfred Harmsworth being the founder of that dynasty, who, of course, owned the old Daily Mail for a while, and owned the several different newspaper titles. And Cecil Harmsworth King was a relative of the Harmsworth dynasty. And he was involved in a coup plot against the Harold Wilson government in the late 1960s. And Pilger covers this with great wit, and how the British establishment was, or the British political, military, and security establishment had essentially started to go mad. Under the strains of capitalist crisis, they were desperate to institute a dictatorship of some kind, and came very close to doing so. And he outlines that Harmsworth King was plotting with this grotesque old reactionary Louis Mountbatten, the Queen's uncle, to institute a dictatorship run by him, and essentially ban the trade union movement, institute a sort of Francoist type regime in Britain. And it came close to coming off. The only reason it didn't was essentially some of the more sensible members of the ruling class decided that they could get everything that they needed without escalating the struggle to the point where it would have taken on revolutionary dimensions. Because if you launch an open military coup, you ban trade unions, you lock up trade union leaders, and you'd lock up the leaders of the organized left, you raise the stakes so much that you essentially force even the corroded labor aristocracy into a fight that you might not have otherwise. In the end, the British bourgeoisie found a more stable route to getting what they wanted, and that was, of course, via the active collaboration between the Conservative Party under Margaret Thatcher and the labor aristocracy in the early 1980s to eliminate trade union militancy as a joint and shared project, which is what that was. But anyway, John Pilger's book, Hidden Agendas, I would recommend. I think it's his best book because it covers a great breadth of the man's work, and it will introduce you in a very accessible way to many different subjects that show the commitment of the man, and the fact that he carved out this career for himself and was still an active reporter to the end of his life is really quite remarkable. His achievements are incredible in the field of journalism. He is the exception that proves the rule. He managed to get into journalism as a young man when the British printed press was still relatively open to members of the working class, or at least certain elements of the working class. You could come in and work your way up, as he did, but unlike many others who did, he never lost sight of his principles. In fact, the longer he existed within the bourgeois press, the stronger his principles became. And so a unique individual has passed away, a man whose commitment to the journalistic profession puts all of his contemporaries to shame, and whose example we can and must learn from. And the best tribute we can give him is to read his work, spread awareness of his work and his life, and to learn from the many different aspects of reporting that he did, and to learn some of the history that he outlined to us during his life and work. So pay tribute to a great man and read the book Hidden Agendas if you haven't done so already. Right, so let's just see who's here. So we have Lee, who says Happy New Year to all. Arnold, Happy New Year to you. Steve Richter, who says R.I.P. John Pilger. Exactly right. Martin says, good morning. I've posted a rather theoretical sort of question on the Telegram channel. I have seen it. I haven't read it properly yet, though, so I will refrain from answering until I've had time to properly consider the question. Good afternoon to Peter from Perfidious Albion. Good afternoon to Will and Morgan and Lars, who says Happy New Year from Sweden. Good afternoon to Alex E. from Wales, and Happy New Year to you. I believe it was you who posed a question in the chat as well. With regard to revolutionary situations in Britain, this probably merits a whole hour to itself. But here's what I would say. There's no such thing as a perfect revolutionary situation. Now, you may say that February 1917 was a perfect revolutionary situation. And my reply there would be that it only looks as much in retrospect. Nobody, really, not even Lenin, saw the February Revolution coming before it arrived. Nobody was, even Lenin in the earlier part of 1917, just before the revolution broke out, even Lenin was not seeing it as an imminent thing, though the situation of the Tsarist regime was, of course, deteriorating. So even then, the working class and peasantry of Russia surprised the professional revolutionaries, as always happens. It's very rare that you get the perfect combination of the subjective and the objective factors that combine together to pull something off as spectacular as October 1917, the later Bolshevik Revolution. So my answer to the question of whether you'll ever see a revolution in Britain, I'll say two things. First of all, we already have. Always remember that Britain gave us the first bourgeois revolution under the ultimately was brought to something of a conclusion under Cromwell's dictatorship. Second of all, even if we think that the working class is crushed and hopelessly atomized and that the bourgeoisie has won, this is always an understandable negative reaction to a situation which appears to be unchanging. But we should always bear in mind that we, unlike bourgeois analysts or petty bourgeois depressive social democrats, we should dig always beneath the surface and examine the longer-term trends in British imperialism. And the longer-term trend points towards crisis and catastrophe, as it has done for quite some time now. More and more people are being impoverished. More and more people are being pushed to a state where they can no longer afford the basics of life anymore. And this can be covered over for a while, as the bourgeoisie has been trying to do via credit expansion, via trying to run, as they did for a long time, a loose monetary policy. They're not doing that anymore. And the whole purpose of what they've been trying to do is to just try to buy time and hope that one of their projects succeeds in a way that would revive things. This is, of course, and we'll come to this when we discuss Belgorod, the bourgeoisie in Britain have been desperately hoping that their Russian project would pay off. This isn't just mania or madness on their part. It isn't just some sort of obsession that they have with getting rid of Putin. They're not as stupid and short-sighted as all that. Their obsession with regime change in Russia and the usage of Ukraine as the tool by which they wish to achieve that is rooted in a very sensible, from their point of view, analysis of the situation. And that analysis of the situation is that their system is rotting away, and they know it now. They understand that British capitalism is in deep trouble. Unlike US imperialism, which has secured for itself a temporary boost via essentially a bastardized version of Keynesianism, trying to inject vast amounts of money into the military production process in the United States and, of course, the energy system. And this, they hope, will produce enough economic growth to convince the US proletariat and petty bourgeois that the economy is somehow growing again in a sustainable fashion. Of course, it isn't. At most, what is currently being displayed in the United States is a temporary blip brought on by gigantic amounts of spending. So you have in the United States at the moment, the official GDP growth rate is around about 5.9%. But bear in mind when we're talking about GDP growth rates, GDP is not the incredibly accurate measurement that it's always portrayed as. It measures, of course, all economic activity inside a country, as I've said before. Now, what it doesn't measure is, of course, and that's quite deliberate, whether that economic activity leads to greater commodity production or not, to greater industrial investment or not. By having a statistic that just measures all economic activity, what it does is, of course, it privileges the kind of narrow and parasitic economic activity that heavily financialized capitalist systems like the United States and Britain have. That's why, of course, they'll say that Ireland is an incredibly dynamic, high-growth economy, because you get an awful lot of economic activity, i.e. money passing through Ireland from multinationals who have headquartered themselves there through various forms of parasitic activity involving property speculation. Same is true in Britain. So GDP growth might be 5.9%, again, assuming that the statistics offered by the US government are accurate. But what you've got there is an awful lot of money washing through the system. It's a gigantic pump priming exercise done by the federal government, which is going to produce a burst of temporarily improved GDP results, and also, though, solve nothing with regard to the long-term problems of the capitalist economy inside the United States. And they're the ones who are actually getting some benefit from the war spending that's going on at the moment. There's no such benefit being seen in Britain. So to come about this question in a roundabout way, I am, of course, getting to the point. There's no such thing as a perfect revolutionary situation, and the 2024 year ahead of us only offers more raising of the level of contradictions in Britain, certainly. There's no way forward for the British government. This is the reason why, of course, Liz Truss, our very short-lived Prime Minister of the previous year, was disposed of because she tried to juice the GDP numbers via cutting taxes and spending. And this was, of course, something that was regarded as too destabilizing by the people who actually run Britain, which is the permanent bureaucracy, because they know very well that any attempt to boost spending, boost economic growth, is, if it's based on trying to secure greater actual growth in the real economy, which to a certain extent Liz Truss's policies were about. A lot of it was also based on parasitism. But if you seek to try and make the economy grow rapidly by boosting the so-called real economy, by boosting manufacturing, of course, and by boosting investment, what you actually threaten to do is to destabilize the whole thing. Now, if you read the analysis, which I periodically find useful, of somebody like Michael Roberts on his blog called The Next Recession, one of the things that he covers quite well is the predominance of zombie companies in Britain. Same is true in the United States. There are thousands of companies which have limped along for many, many years due to the very low interest rates making their debt payments affordable. Now the interest rates have gone up, things start to get destabilized in terms of potential bankruptcies. And I give this example because this points to a fundamental problem in Britain, which is the large amount of zombie companies staggering around under the weight of this enormous and unpayable debt. Points to this much bigger problem, which is that the entire economy is underpinned by gigantic amounts of debt. The entire British economy, even more so than the United States, is based on essentially unlimited borrowing capacities of both the state, companies, and individuals. Hence, I mean, the only plan that the British government has had with regard to restoring economic growth over the last 15 years since the recession began, which turned into a long depression, has been to reinflate the housing bubble, has been to try and get people borrowing and spending more again, to essentially try and rebuild the system that existed prior to 2008, albeit maybe with a couple more regulations thrown in. That's the only plan that we have going into the 2024 election cycle in Britain. And apparently the election is going to be in May. So again, to go back to the question of a revolutionary situation in Britain, we're already in a situation where the capitalist class has only one way forward. And that is to, of course, either their big plan, as I was mentioning, in trying to secure the overthrow or collapse of the Putin system in Russia, and being able to, along with the United States, get their share of the loot when the Russian system collapses. This has failed, even though they're desperate to try and keep it going. They're not going to secure the collapse of China either. So they're left with nowhere to go, other than, of course, launching attacks on the working class in this country, which is very risky. Because the working class in this country, not just the poorer end, but even like the bits of the labour aristocracy, even bits of the petty bourgeoisie, even for them, life is becoming more difficult. Now, what turns an objective situation, which the objective situation we are in, which is that the capitalists, to again draw on Lenin's phrase, the capitalist class cannot continue to rule in the old way. The working class cannot and will not much longer consent to be governed in the old way. And so that, of course, produces a crisis. The ruling class will need, now that their foreign adventures are all leading to failure, there will be a need for them to go on the attack in a more serious and sustained way than before, by seeking to revive profitability, by carrying out direct assaults on the working class in a way they've sought to avoid in previous decades. Now, you may say the British working class has been constantly attacked by the ruling class, and that is true. But the way in which that they have carried out those attacks in previous decades has been much more careful. They were careful to isolate the National Union of Mine Workers, for instance, in the 1980s. And it was with the collaboration of the labour aristocracy that they were able to do that. And they have been careful not to launch attacks across the board, always seeking to keep their enemy, the working class, divided by attacking one section of the working class against and then offering what they would say protections to another, playing off the lower paid working class against the higher paid working class, playing off the labour aristocracy against everybody else. All of these things are methods of rule which the British bourgeoisie is very long practiced at and has perfected to some degree. The problem for them now is that their situation is getting too desperate. In the 2000s, it was the case that they could, via their successful pillaging of a country like Iraq, they could put off the crisis for a little while, not that long as it turned out. Because the long-term crisis of British capitalism has been running for, I would argue, since the late 19th century. And each round of the crisis has seen more deindustrialization and more indebtedness grow up, even though, of course, the bourgeois declare that they've found a new way back to growth again. Now the only way back to growth is a direct assault on the working class, so a direct assault that will remove certain privileges that the labour aristocracy has long cherished. Which means, of course, the breakout of more vicious class war, which is exactly why they want Keir Starmer to be the one to front all this up, not Rishi Sunak, which is why Keir Starmer is being pushed in to be Prime Minister in Britain. So, to reach the end of my answer on this particular question, the revolutionary situation, the objective requirement for revolution exists in Britain because the system has no means of going forward in a progressive fashion and hasn't had for many, many years. The gap that exists now is the gap between the objective situation, which is there is an objective requirement for a revolution in Britain because there is no other way for this country to go forward. But then there's the gap to the between the objective situation and the subjective factor. The subjective factor being the presence of and the organization of a revolutionary party, and of course the consciousness of the working class. The consciousness of the working class in Britain is rather mixed. No one in the working class is happy with the current status quo, but of course you have an awful lot of what in classical Marxist terms you would call false consciousness. You have a lot of anger shooting in the wrong direction. You have a lot of people getting angry about various different things which either don't matter or that they are being offered as distractions, immigration being, of course, the biggest one. So the anger and the frustration with life in Britain is there, but it's going in the wrong directions due to a lack of the subjective factor, which is, of course, that there hasn't been a revolutionary party with the necessary roots in the working class in Britain probably since 1945. So this is our problem. Our problem isn't that the system is strong. It is not strong. It is weak and getting weaker. The problem is not that the working class has an overabundance of faith in capitalism. There is some, of course, but more and more the working class, even its upper layers, become more and more divorced from the system and more disillusioned with it. Again, this manifests in different ways due to the weaknesses of the subjective factor at the moment. The problem lies in the fact that of organization and leadership, and that's, of course, our task. Now, we might say, as some do correctly, that the working class is smashed and demoralized and atomized at the moment. It's all true. There's no point denying that particular reality. But the point about Marxist-Leninism is that we have a method by which we seek to analyze the situation, and using the Marxist method, we can find ways to address this lacking of the subjective factor and rebuild ourselves accordingly. And there will be a desire amongst at least a minority of the working class for answers that go beyond what the bourgeoisie or the petty bourgeois paid hacks of the ruling class are prepared to offer. And so our task is to rebuild a communist party in Britain, and that is the most urgent priority for 2024. There is no way, in my view, that not only is it the case that the election of Starmer will solve nothing, but the election of Starmer won't even give the bourgeoisie the respite they desire, because the working class already sees through Starmer and doesn't want anything to do with him and will not believe him and his assertions when he comes along and says he's planning to save the NHS or restore growth or something stupid like that, because it's going to be obvious what he's there to do, and he's there to carry out the attacks that the ruling class believe Rishi Sunak can't get away with making. And so there is going to be a wave of potential radicalization, and so we as communists in Britain need to be ready for it. Now, there will be dangerous times ahead, there will be trials and tribulations ahead, but with the objective situation as it is, the ruling class cannot continue to rule in the old way, and so hence there can be no going back now. They all hope that they can just keep dividing the working class and grinding us all down to accept progressively worse living standards, but the problem for them is that the 20th century existed and can't be made to go away. People have been brought up to expect, even if we haven't seen it ourselves, that our lives and the lives of any children that we may have are going to be better than the lives of our parents and grandparents. The fact that the ruling class has been trying via various different methods to inculcate in people a new diminished level of expectations isn't really working, because everybody remembers that for at least a generation or possibly two, life improved, materially speaking. And so you can't just put that back in the box again. So their attempts to persuade people that life should get worse are going to end in failure. The 20th century and the legacy of the October Revolution is still strong, in the sense that it gave the working class, even in the imperialist countries, which of course had to be bought off via concessions after World War II, it gave them a raised level of expectations which can't be relegated. It can't be put away anymore. You can't get the working class to embrace the idea that they're all going to be worse off. And so far, up to this point, the ruling class has tried to say that it will find some way back to growth. It's still trying to say that a little bit with Starmer. But what they'd love to do is for the working class to accept that life is going to be nasty, brutish and short again. But they can't do that anymore. And so here we have insoluble contradictions facing the British ruling class that they can't get around anymore. And these all provide opportunities for communists to organise around. And this is exactly what we will be doing in the next year. CJ asks, does that mean that the British workers' task is to build the CPGB-ML? Yes. In the immediate period, CPGB-ML are the only actual communist party in Britain, and therefore communists should be investigating the party's programme, seeing if they agree with it, and looking to join it and organise within it. That's what I'm doing, and that's what I recommend everybody else who considers themselves to be a Marxist-Leninist or communist or both in Britain does as well. Right, so let's pause now for some questions. Good afternoon to Beans, who says Happy New Year from Yorkshire. Mutanda says R.I.P. John Pilger. Indeed. CJ, greetings from Richmond, Virginia. Looking forward to the next year. All the heavens are in chaos. Indeed they are. Happy New Year, comrades, says Irish Partisan, our comrade in Minsk. Joel Bachman says good evening from Malaysia. Good evening to you. And Rob says Happy New Year. Thank you for the book recommendation. Be sure to check it out. Yep. Irish Partisan says, I recall the late John Pilger on the receiving end of a vicious smear campaign during the Kosovo War. Yes, because he dared to point out the truth about that war, which is that it was a revolting colonial war. Peter says, weird because I never met him, but I feel a sense of personal loss and mournfulness over the passing of John Pilger. Dingo and baby, hello to you. Martin, I'll probably answer your question tomorrow in written form, and then I'm happy to discuss it at length on the stream. Peter says, I know he's not a Marxist-Leninist, but I think Badieu's notion of rupturing revolutionary event that seems to come from nowhere and exceeds its causes is something to hold on to sustain optimism. Badieu was a Maoist at one stage, wasn't he? I'm not sure whether he still is, but yes, that's a good point. Solidarity Comrades says Muzzle Paint. Good afternoon to you. Good afternoon to Jerry, who appreciates the life of John Pilger, and quite right too. Good evening to Muniz from a cold, windy, cloudy Denmark. Jenny Lynn, good morning to you, R.A.P. John Pilger. Rob A says Starmer is a bad Blair tribute act. Yeah, and he's not even as good an actor as Blair. Blair, at least, is or was a good actor in his time. He's not anymore, but he could at least sell things. Starmer's not a very good salesman. Jenny Lynn says facts. Thank you very much. Is there a party that I like in Germany? Well, I don't want to commit myself to that at the moment. What I will say is that I'm organising, hopefully in the next week or so, an interview with comrades from Germany, and so D, your question may be answered then. What do you consider valid groups, organisations in the USA? Well, there's an interesting question. Not very many. I mean, you can forget the trot groups and the post-trot groups like PSL, Workers' World Party, all those like Trotskyite variants, just forget it, completely useless, largely tied in with the Democratic Party in practical terms, even if they denounce them in rhetorical terms. Party of Communists USA has some good positions, I think. So, I mean, I've read through their stuff. There's some elements of it that I vehemently disagree with, but there's some elements of it which I find very useful. So, I mean, I think American comrades should certainly read through their program. I think there's a lot of elements with which I would agree with their program. I think the bulk of it I do. Some of their, I have disagreements with them over their stance on the identity politics questions, but they're signed up to. I think they're signed up to the World Anti-Imperialist platform. So I think the bulk of their program, comrades who are watching this would probably agree with. But PC USA, yeah, go away, read their stuff, and see what you think of it yourself. I think they're probably the best organization in the USA that I am aware of. If there are Americans out there who have a better awareness of this than me, then feel free to post about it. So we move on. Now, a couple of things I wanted to pick up. Of course, there was the attack in Belgorod the other day, which wounded over 100, and reportedly was made by the Ukrainians using a Czech-supplied multiple launch rocket system. The Russians demanded a meeting of the Security Council and accused the British of carrying this out, and the Czechs of having provided the equipment to do so. Now, usually I wouldn't go and look at this with any particular degree of depth or length of time, because this is the motion of war. This is a fairly standard way of operating that the Ukrainians carry out. The Russians, even their enemies, would have to agree, even if they wouldn't probably acknowledge it publicly, that they're very careful to minimize civilian casualties. Just look, I mean, Putin and others have made the comparison with how the Israelis behave, but also you can make the comparison with how the Ukrainians behave, or how, should we say, the Ukrainian forces fighting for NATO behave, which is indiscriminate targeting of the civilian population. But the question I wanted to ask is that, is the point I wanted to make, is that the Belgorod attacks appears to serve no useful military purpose that I can see. It doesn't prevent the Russian advances that are going on across the front line, and it doesn't stop the Russians from taking Marinka. It doesn't stop them from advancing around Avdiivka. It doesn't stop the positional maneuvers that the Russians are doing up near Kharkov, and that the Russians are clearly moving into a situation where they will carry out some form of offensive in the new year at some point before the spring, perhaps. It's certainly what most of the military analysis channels are now speculating about. And they have a gigantic number of men that they haven't deployed yet. So attacking Belgorod and killing a bunch of civilians doesn't do anything to aid the Ukrainians' military efforts in any serious way. So why do it, is the question. Well, the reason they do it is the same reason they do anything. It's because they have one tactic in this war, really. And that tactic is to essentially follow the direction of the largely the British so-called specialists. And what the British specialists specialize in isn't military victories. No British officer has won a victory in a military campaign of any serious nature, arguably since you could say the Falklands War, perhaps, though beating a conscript army sent in by a crumbling dictatorship isn't exactly, winning the Battle of Stalingrad. But you can make the argument that the British commanders won that war, and indeed they did. But in terms of battles against a peer competitor, there's been nothing since World War II in Britain. So what the British specialise in is psyops, which is what this is. It's a deadly psyop, But it's another case of the Ukrainians essentially following the direction of the British. And the British officers and intelligence men's idea is, well, if we just hit the Russians in this area, if we just use this weapon on them, if we just kill this number of civilians, if we just do this or that or the other, and if we can just prolong the war for another few months or years, then eventually, it's going to pay off and everything's going to collapse. And the sanctions regime is going to kick in and we're going to win. And Putin's regime is going to crumble. The Russian economy is going to crumble into, return into sand. And that's the hope, that by doing something like this, that they expose the terrible Putin regime as being impotent and having led the Russian population only into death and destruction. And therefore the Russian population will get sick of Putin and abandon his regime and turn on them, and chaos will envelop the Russian Federation. The Putin regime will fall, and then the West can dictate terms to presumably the reincarnation of Boris Yeltsin, who takes over, or however the cards fall, shall we say. And this is the purpose of things like the Belgorod attack. And the purpose of it was given away, actually, by the British diplomat who was addressing the meeting of the UN Security Council called by the Russians, who says that this twat, he's barely even he's not even older than me. He comes on and he goes, the Russians should look for the real killer of the Russian people is Putin. It's all his fault, etc. Because, of course, they're never going to admit their own culpability. Now, of course, this won't work. Putin, without needing to break a sweat, will win the Russian presidential election by a country mile. For whatever criticisms one might have of him and his setup, and I have plenty, the government that he runs is very popular, and the Russian population will vote for him overwhelmingly. So whatever the British plan was here, it just has not come off, isn't going to work, will never work. But this is how they're going to fight it from now on, or it's how they've been fighting it for years. They think, or they desperately hope, I should say, that if they can just find this one weird trick will cause the Russian system to collapse. If we can just attack the Kerch Bridge enough times, if we can demonstrate Putin's impotence by cutting off Crimea by destruction of the bridge. But of course Crimea can be resupplied by sea, and indeed was for years. Or if we can just use this particular weapon on them, then surely everything will collapse. It's just wishful thinking. It's just wishful thinking expressed in the most brutal fashion, because of course it leads to the large-scale death and injury of Russian civilians, and of course the death of even more Ukrainians. But there's no rhyme or reason to these attacks other than wishful thinking, which is all that the British and the Americans have left now. And of course, if they also hope that the Russians will respond by mass killing Ukrainian civilians. They're not doing that. According to a report from a military summary channel that I saw this morning, what the Russians are doing every time that this comes off, and that the Ukrainian NATO forces, shall we say, or the NATO-led Ukrainian forces kill a large number of civilians, what the Russians do, in fact, is they find out where the NATO officers and NATO assets are in a particular area and go after them. That's what they do, which is a very sensible way of doing business. The Russian government has never responded to attacks on their own civilian population in the way that the Israelis are doing right now. They are going after the things that matter to NATO, which is they're killing, apparently, or trying to, large numbers of NATO military personnel, including Polish operatives, British operatives, Americans. These will, of course, in terms of the British and the Americans that are killed, they won't show up on any official casualty list. They'll be listed as having been killed in helicopter crashes, road accidents, unfortunate drowning in their own vomit, spontaneous human combustion, died in a bizarre gardening incident. usual things that the British and American militaries use to disguise the fact that they're having large numbers of men killed in various battlefields where they're not supposed to be. So, the Belgorod attack, we can expect more like this, and we can expect the Russians to respond in the same way. But the war will continue as it is. The Russians will not change their overall objectives. One of the objectives that the British will have had by doing this is to try and derail potential Russian plans for a major offensive that appears to be being built up for. Those plans won't change, and that's the nature of the beast at the moment. The grinding down of Ukrainian forces is, if not complete, then near complete. And they're not going to be able to train this 500,000 strong army that Zelensky says that he needs, even with the ridiculous 2 to 3 week training program that the Ukrainians are being put through. They're not going to get 500,000 men trained even to the smallest degree and then into the field against the Russians. Especially now we can expect the Russians to change the nature of the game, which means, of course, they will need at some point soon, and this goes towards potential endgames in Ukraine, to launch a more widespread assault across the front lines. If they aim, which of course I believe that they do, to take Odessa, to take and hold Kharkov, and if we believe Dmitry Medvedev, and he appears to be something of a prophet at the moment, then ultimately to take Kiev. Because I think that, and here we get into the realm of the prediction, we are into the point where we have reached the point where the Russian government has been forced, against its own instincts, to draw the conclusion that the only way that this is going to be ended is if they end it in a military fashion. There is no deal to be had with the Kiev regime as it currently is constituted. Bear in mind, both Poroshenko and Zelensky both said in their elections that they would be the men who could make peace with Moscow. Poroshenko said it because, well, he had a good reason to think that, given he has had at least, very extensive business interests in Russia. If any man was regarded as someone who could be relied upon to have it in his best interest to set up good relations with Moscow, it would have been Poroshenko, the chocolate oligarch, as he's called, or was called. But of course, Poroshenko became the number one fan, or the number one hype man for Azov. Why? For the same reason that Zelensky has become the number one hype man for Banderism. Because when they got into office, they were probably told, you must pursue the war until victory. That would have been what the Americans and the British would have told them. And they would have been told domestically that the most serious organized force in Ukraine is, of course, Banderism. And the Banderists will not accept anything other than a unitary state run by them that sees the Russian language and culture eliminated. And so Poroshenko, followed by Zelensky, were both left with a choice. Stand by what you committed to in the election, or flip and become a hype man for Bandera, which is what they both did. So there's no force that exists inside the Kiev regime that can negotiate, no matter what the Americans might say they want. Because the Americans would like Zelensky or whoever, or Zaluzny or somebody, Yulia Tymoshenko perhaps, to reach some kind of unofficial, perhaps, bargain with the Russians, freeze the conflict, stick Ukraine, or what's left of it, in NATO and the EU, and then spend years building it up again so they can have another go at the Russians later on. That's what they want. The Russians aren't going to give them the opportunity for that, because they now know the game, and they know that they can't trust anything that the Kiev regime says, not while the only real organized armed force that exists inside the Ukrainian state is, of course, Banderism, which is why Putin's stated objective of demilitarization and denazification means the systematic annihilation of the Banderist forces to the point where they no longer exist and can no longer exert any influence. So the question becomes, well, does it end? And it has to end via either the Ukrainian regime being pushed to the point of collapse, which I think is the preference that the Russian government would have, is that they continue to essentially erode the Ukrainian regime to the point where it simply is unable to function anymore and completely collapses, and that the Americans slip quietly away in the night, which is kind of what they're planning to do anyway. The Biden regime clearly wants to get out of this, but leave the door open to come back to it somehow. They won't get that opportunity. Now, the only question is whether the Russians just simply carry on slowly advancing and grinding down the Ukrainian forces, or do they look to finish it in a more dramatic fashion? By that I mean attacks all the way across the front line, the taking of large areas of now Ukrainian occupied territory, and the ending of the war via the physical destruction of the Kiev regime and the forcing of whatever is left of it to sign an unconditional surrender. Do they do that, or do they go for the slower option? The budget for this appears to run till 2025. So the Russians are clearly hedging their bets as to exactly how it is ended. But my guess is that one of the reasons why the Russians have been moving in such a slow fashion is, of course, partly because their tactic is about the physical annihilation of the Ukrainian military, but also that each stage Putin has been looking, or the Russian government, I should say, has been looking to see if the Americans, the American imperialists, have been brought around to the point where they are prepared to negotiate. And so far, that's not been the case. So far, what's happened is that every time the Ukrainians have been defeated, the US imperialists try and prop them up for another few months. That's what lies behind the attempt to not only seize all these Russian assets, but also be able to turn them into something that the Ukrainians can draw on, which of course they're looking to do by late February of next year, 2024. So in order to keep the Ukrainian regime funded for a little while, keep it staggering on for another few months. So maybe what has happened is that finally the Russian government has decided that there's no deal to be had there, certainly not with the Kiev regime, and not even with the United States, which is not prepared to acknowledge that it needs to negotiate with the Russian government at all. So that leaves the door open to the Russians forcing a military solution here. In which case, well, how do the Americans react? Now, some may say that the Biden or whoever is making the decisions might flip out and decide to try and threaten some kind of nuclear action. I don't think that that's going to be the case. I think what is going to be the case is that they will simply try to keep the war going, and as long as there is a square inch of territory that can be called Ukraine, they will try and keep the war going. And if that means keeping things going until, of course, what's left of Ukraine is forced into old Galicia and around Lvov, and if that is the only territory left open to them, then they'll keep it going that way. And if the only aim that the US imperialists have is to keep the Russians fighting and dying for as long as possible. That's the only aim they've got now. They know that they can't win on the battlefield. They've all but admitted that. But they want to keep it going anyway. First of all, to avoid the question of being seen as weak. Second of all, because they still hope on some level that if they can cause the Russians a great deal of expenditure of blood and treasure, that eventually there'll be some kind of internal revolt or collapse, and then I don't know, President Navalny will emerge out of the ruins. Again, this is nonsense, but this is the way in which they're thinking. So their only aim for 2024 will be to keep it going in one form or another, even if it's just an insurgency, even if it's just a terrorist campaign, even if it's just, Banderist suicide bombers or something like that. Anything to keep the situation bloody and destabilized. That is the only aim the US imperialists have. Eventually, though, they will be obliged to scuttle out of there. And this is, of course, what the British imperialists fear. That eventually the Americans will scale back their involvement to the point where they're just running essentially a terrorist campaign. So that is the way in which it is going. The only question the question I am not clear on is are the Russians going to go for a more rapid victory or a more drawn out one? Everything that has been seen so far indicates that perhaps they are going to do some form of offensive, but anybody expecting Operation Bagration again, I think he's in for a disappointment. I think what you're going to see is the steady pressure being increased on the Kiev regime in the hope that it will crack at some point, and that the Russians can just mop up what is left. But again, it depends upon whether the Russians can exert enough pressure to cause the Kiev regime to crumble. We'll see. The preference of the Russian government seems to be that they wish to carry on in a limited fashion, grinding away to the point where Kiev can't continue fighting anymore. But we will have to see how that shakes out. Right, okay. Going back to comments. Peter says, as far as I know, Badiou has never repudiated his 60s Maoism. Interesting. CJ says, one great difficulty I have is that there are no PC USA people within my area. It seems that there's no point in joining. Jenny says, PC USA has a great channel here on YouTube. People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies. Interesting. Irish Partisan says, the Belgorod episode highlights just how desperate the Ukrainians and the West are. This was an attempt to goad Moscow into a desperate act, i.e. escalator. 2024 will be a very bumpy year. Yes, their aim is to derail Moscow's planning, which they won't succeed in doing, I don't think. Gillian likes the Spinal Tap reference. Glad to see it. Because in 2024, says Irish Partisan, we have Taiwan elections as well as presidential elections in Russia and the US, not to mention Yemen, occupied Palestine, and simmering tensions in Balkans, i.e. Kosovo and Serbia. Well, exactly. A lot to look forward to in many respects. I'll come back to Kosovo in a later program, I think. CJ says, trying to bring together PC USA people from all three corners of Virginia proved impractical. Well, you're dealing with a bigger geographical proximity than me, so I can't exactly judge there. Irish Partisan says, a resounding Russian victory on the battlefield in 2024 will reverberate around the globe. Lots of unknowns and maybe a black swan event. Gillian agrees with Irish Partisan, things don't bode well. Reading up on game theory, well, we could do a whole episode on that. Peter says, an obsession with managing imagery is a hallmark of mendacious narcissism. Late Christopher Lash wrote brilliantly about it. Well, the management of or should we say the curation of an image is an obsession of the bourgeoisie in the West, because this is the nature of the fragility of this. It's part of a manifestation of the fragility of the system. Late stage imperialism is actually very, very fragile. And unless it can constantly present an image of enduring strength, then it risks a confidence collapse. And if you get a collapse in confidence, particularly a collapse in confidence in the dollar or the pound, and a collapse in confidence in terms of international investors moving their money through the City of London or Wall Street, then that presents a serious and possibly existential problem. So the obsession with image, which of course relates to the Trump question, the obsession with image in the imperialist countries does come from a material place, which is that the lingering power of the imperialists is based, an awful lot of it is based purely on reputation. It's not based on material strength anymore. Like, it's based on a legacy of prior strength. So, like, British imperialism, or what are its strengths in terms of its actual ability to do anything? It's not based on productive investment. It's not based on military might anymore. There's nothing of that left. Britain couldn't win a war these days against even Javier Milei's Argentina. So what is it based on? It's based on the historic legacy. I mean, there's the line from Marx where he says that the dead labor hangs over the heads of the living, because of course the power of British imperialism is based on, of course, the dead labor of multiple generations of the British proletariat, and of course those exploited in the colonial possessions. And it's the accumulated dead labor of all those millions and billions over hundreds of years that puts British imperialism in the position that it is today. It's not based on the current strength of British imperialism or British capitalism. It's based on the strengths of British imperialism since the early 19th century, since the defeat of Napoleon. That's what we're living in. We're living in a legacy. And the legacy is preserved by periodic murderous rampages that are now largely carried out by proxy forces. Hence why Britain cannot go and fight Russia. Britain cannot go and fight China. They would lose within probably days. So the question is, like, well, what can it do? And the only thing it can do is to try and preserve its current status in the world and its current reputation by convincing everybody that it is all-powerful via, and of course, its alliance with American imperialism, but also the Western control over the global financial system, the Western ability to make a war on anybody at any time. But now we are in a position where Mao's dictum about imperialism being a paper tiger becomes true. What you have is, of course, you have people like the Ansar Allah in Yemen. The Yemenis exposing imperialism for what it is, which is a paper tiger. Imperialism's been beating up small, isolated countries for 40 years. Since Reagan's great revival of the American military by sending it in to invade Grenada, or Panama, or Somalia, where, by the way, they lost and got forced out, or destroying Iraq or Libya, often by, again, using proxy forces, or the Iraq war case, where they invaded and tried to launch an enduring occupation, only to be exposed as incapable of quelling the resistance forces there, or that they were unable to overcome thus far the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela. Because why? Because, again, it's the paper tiger question. The imperialists would love to invade Venezuela and destroy the Bolivarian revolution there, but they can't, because the masses there are mobilized, armed, ideologically as well as materially armed, and any attempt at an invasion by the US would be met with defeat. They would lose. Again, they can inflict a lot of pain and misery, but they would lose. And so this creates a fundamental problem for US imperialism, which is that it's getting exposed because it can't fight. It can't fight because it can't mobilize it can't make an appeal to the masses in the United States to go off and die for the empire. Bear in mind, US imperialist wars have only tried to draw upon draft armies twice. in recent history. There's the War of Korean National Liberation, which was partially won by the DPRK and led to at least a partial defeat for the US imperialists, and they had to pull the plug on it in the end. They couldn't win. And in Vietnam, where they lost, and there was a massive military revolt there. Since then, they've gone to a volunteer army, and now they can't get enough volunteers for their army. And if they try and draw upon the American masses to go and fight in some imperial war against the Chinese or the Russians, which will see Americans die by the thousands every single week, that's not going to be something that the social contract, to use Rousseau's old term, that exists between the American proletariat and the ruling class, that social contract doesn't exist anymore. This isn't the era of New Deal capitalism. This isn't even the era of LBJ anymore. This is an era where the authority and the respect for the governing institutions of American capitalism has never been lower. So the paper tiger here cannot call upon the masses of their own countries, because, again, to use Mao's analysis from that very famous piece of writing, their links to the masses are incredibly weak. The masses despise them, so they can't make war that way. They can't. Their opponents in the colonized world, the neo-colonial world, have got the measure of them now, and they know their army, the imperialist armies, can't fight. The Palestinians, under the weight of enormous suffering, at the moment are being killed in their thousands, but their fighters, the Palestinian National Liberation Forces, are exposing the American colonial army known as Israel, because that's what Israel is. It is an American colonial occupation force, and that army's being exposed in Gaza as being weak, as being poorly trained, poorly led, only capable of TikTok videos and brutalization. And this is being exposed every day by the Palestinian forces, and it's being exposed every day by the Lebanese forces, typified and led by Hezbollah. And so there's no way back now. The Russian war against NATO in Ukraine has exposed the US and the British as being cowardly, as being paper tigers. The Palestinians have exposed the supposedly high-tech warfare waged by the Israelis as being something which is completely impotent, as being an army which can't fight, is only capable of sadism and cruelties, and is not led by competent officers. It is not staffed by brave men. It is an army of occupation which is completely demotivated, demoralized, and depraved. And then you turn to one of the other most significant elements or stories of the last year, which is the eviction of the French forces from the Sahel, the eviction of the French from Niger, their eviction from Mali, their eviction from Burkina Faso and Guinea, and the moving of these countries towards some kind of federation. Again, we're constantly under the threat of coups and of imperialist intervention, with the rumor that Erdogan has apparently sent some of his grotesque army of foreign intervention into Niger to bolster the jihadists. But there was a very interesting reflection happened recently when you read, occasionally I will pick up like the Guardian newspaper and read it, and it says French forces have removed themselves from Mali and Niger after years of fighting jihadists. But of course they weren't fighting jihadists. Every single study done into jihadist violence in Mali or Niger shows that, strangely enough, the more the French or the Americans or the British deployed forces there, the greater the number of jihadist attacks there were. Almost as if the more imperialism was present anywhere, the greater the number of jihadist incidents there were. Almost as if the jihadists were working with the imperialists, which of course they are, Erdogan's role in this is significant, given that he supplies these jihadist armies to various different locations in and around the North African and Middle East region. And imperialism's war against against terror, so to speak, was always only ever a piece of shadow play. It was a shadow play. It was a puppet theatre incident. The imperialists pretended to be fighting the jihadists in Mali and Niger, whereas in actual fact what they were there to do was to make sure that the jihadists remained a threat. They were there to make sure that the countries remained divided, that the country remained weak, that they could continue to justify a military presence there by pointing at the jihadist threat. But of course, they were never there to address the jihadist threat. They were there to ensure that the French got free access to the uranium and gold resources in places like Niger. And so for the Nigerians, the Malians, the Burkinabes to finally reach the point where they could remove the French imperialists from their nation, again, the world is spinning round the axis established by the Russian special military operation now. The longer that goes on, the weaker the West gets, the more these national liberation struggles break out. And it's very important that these national liberation struggles are supported until victory, because the more that the Europeans and the British and the Americans can be forced out of not just the Sahel but Africa as a whole, the greater the crisis of capitalism becomes inside France and Britain and the United States, because the less they are able to hyper-exploit the people and the resources of the Sahel and the other African nations, the greater the chances are of revolutionary events breaking out inside the home nations of imperialism, because they can no longer exploit those countries in order to use the resources they gather from them to make concessions at home anymore. And for those reasons, they are something that we should very much support. But the move towards confederation in the Sahel between Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso is one of the most significant events of the last year. But to turn back, just before we reach any kind of conclusions here, to the Israeli question, I was going to address why the Israeli propaganda keeps focusing on these completely false allegations of mass rapes on October the 7th. And this, of course, relates to the New York Times piece recently, but also the ridiculous propaganda done by The Intercept and others. The reason why, of course, they keep bringing this story up, first of all, I should say, of course, it's a completely false story. They have absolutely no evidence that any of this stuff occurred. If they had pictures or any kind of evidence that was reliable, they'd be shouting about it. But what they're doing is they're writing these very tricky articles saying that on October the 7th there was a massive attack on Israel from Hamas forces. There were mass rapes were reported. Several incidents of rape were reported, they will say. They will never cite anything. The sources that if they do, it's usually like one is unnamed Israeli source that has been used before and always has been proven to be to talk complete shit, or is just simply made up. So this story is complete falsity. It's complete falsehood. It's only being brought out because nothing else has worked. The protests for solidarity with Palestine and solidarity with the Palestinian struggle have been so big and powerful that they have frightened the imperialists to the point where they're desperately trying to derail them. And that's why they're bringing out this rape story. That's the only reason. They don't have any evidence of this because, as we've seen from the conduct of the Palestinian fighters so far, they're not the kind of ill-disciplined terroristic rabble that US imperialist propaganda wishes to portray them as, or that Bill Maher might believe that they are. The mass rapes this mass sexual assaults that are carried out by the forces of imperialism. It's always a case of projection when it comes to these pieces of propaganda. The imperialists go on and on and on about the sex crimes of the subjugated peoples, when in actual fact, when you look at it, it's always their armies or their security forces who are actually carrying out the abominable acts, who are actually carrying out mass rapes. And there's very many documented cases of the Israeli army doing exactly that. Whereas the Palestinian fighters, when people are actually questioned about, or the former hostages were questioned when they were initially released, they were talking about how disciplined and orderly they were. And then later on, after the Israeli government had gone to work on some of these people, they then started saying, oh, well, we heard about assaults. We didn't see any. Everybody says we've heard this, we've heard that. Never any confirmation, because it didn't happen. Because the whole purpose of the Palestinian National Liberation Fighters seizing hostages from Israel wasn't to torture them or brutalize them. It was to exchange them for Palestinian prisoners. And you won't be able to do that if you've been torturing and brutalizing them. So again, it's all complete gibberish. It's all complete nonsense. This is designed to try and distract from, or to try and derail the solidarity movement. It's not working, because there's too many instances now where it is demonstrably the case that the Israeli government has lied about absolutely everything, including their own responsibility for the large-scale killings of civilians via the application of the so-called Hannibal Doctrine on and around October the 7th. So the defeat of Israel is coming. Now, I will emphasize that this is going to take, of course, some time, and recently Palestinian groups have been talking about following the Algerian example. Now, the Algerian example, of course, is an important one, but to mention this, that we should, of course, mention, though, that the number of people who died in that struggle was enormous. Over 1 million Algerians were killed in the 15-year struggle between the end of World War II and the final act of gaining independence in the early 1960s. So that was an incredibly brutal war waged by French imperialism to try and hang on to Algeria. We can expect the US imperialists, because that's who's really waging this war, to be no less brutal in their application of terror in defense of Israel, or in defense of their Israeli colony. But the result will be the same. The longer this goes on, and the longer the Israelis get exposed as not only brutal and murderous, but also incompetent and cowardly, the more resistance will grow, not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, and also inside Israel itself. There will be escalation inside Israel. I'm convinced there will be more resistance from the Arab population who hold Israeli citizenship, and there will be more escalations against them by the likes of Ben Gvir and the settlers. This is the road that Israel is on now. It leads only towards its dismantling, one way or another. And like the Algerian war, that might take a number of more years. That might involve many more deaths. So remember, as I said, the Algerian war cost the lives of 1 million Algerians. But in the end, it'll be something that sees the end of Israel, ultimately. Though, of course, this is linked to the power of US imperialism within the region. So it's, as Hassan Nasrallah has noted on many different occasions, it is also a case of the wider struggle across Syria and Iraq and Yemen to rid the whole area of the domination of US imperialism. That's the struggle. Palestine is the center of the struggle at the moment, but it's also a struggle to finally remove US and therefore British imperialism from the region entirely. And if that can be successful, then it will further amplify the crisis of US and British imperialism as we go into 2024. So, this is a ongoing and escalating crisis of imperialism that we face going into 2024. Another year of chaos and change. The centerpiece of which remains, or two centerpieces, should we say, the Russian war against NATO in Ukraine, and of course the region-wide struggle centered on occupied Palestine in the Middle East, with, of course, the Sahel playing an important role as well. These are three areas that are going to be crucial as we go forward. I can't see the US being able to wage a war or trigger a war in Taiwan that it can hope to win in 2024. We may see further escalations there depending upon the outcome of the Taiwanese presidential election. But overall, what I would say that the year to come promises us is an escalation of all the trends that we've had in the last 12 months. So the crisis of capitalism inside the imperialist bloc is only going to intensify. We've seen Macron survive the Yellow Vest movement, survive the anti-pension so-called reform movement inside France, and survived largely due to the fact that the subjective factor in France has been lacking, that of a revolutionary party. Certainly Mélenchon and his crew are manifestly inadequate. But the crisis will resume in Germany as well, and in Britain, and in Italy, and in Spain. Nowhere in Europe or in the outskirts, such as Britain, is going to be immune from the gigantic crisis of the imperialist system, which is only going to intensify in 2024. And so we have ahead of us a year of crisis and a year of potential breakthroughs and opportunities. But it's also a year where you're going to have to see the working class beat its head against more brick walls, as what the working class is doing in almost every country now, or certain layers of it are doing, is they are moving through different phases of struggle. The Yellow Vests was one form of struggle that was arose because of the frustrations and inadequacies that the French left displayed, so that when you got these struggles breaking out, they broke out in ways which sought to free themselves of French left structures that had become either wholly inadequate or had become an active enemy to the working class. The French workers go through the Yellow Vest struggle, and that the methods of struggle are revealed as inadequate. They go through the trade union struggle over the pension reform. Only that struggle reveals itself to be inadequate. More of these will occur, and more new tactics or recycled old tactics, I should say, will be used. But what will become obvious if communists do our work in the correct way is that the question of the superiority of Leninist forms of organization, the Leninist form of organization, comes to the fore again, because all these other forms of struggle that workers have been engaging in, be it the trade union struggle, the inadequacies of the official trade union structures, the inadequacies of the old and corrupted and treacherous social democratic parties, the inadequacies of spontaneity and leaderless movements and things like that. All of that will present itself to the class as the struggle unfolds, leading, of course, to us to have the need to be out there making the case for the Leninist form of organization, for communist parties, and to be recreated in such a way as to be able to act as vanguard parties again in a way that's not been done for over 60 years. And all of these lessons are being learnt by the class as the class goes through these different methods of struggle that prove inadequate. And this is the cycle that we are going through. We come out of a long period of defeat, which came out of a long period of deviations, depoliticization, and revisionism. And so we have to overcome all of these weighty legacies of the past, and they are being overcome bit by bit. It'll take a little while longer, but the question will present itself with more urgency as time goes on. Right. I'll read out the final few comments now. Log66, why do you rely exclusively on YouTube for your videos? I do that because I did stream on other platforms for a while, but nobody watched it. So it was a waste of bandwidth, basically. I do have an Odyssey and a Rumble channel. I will use those if YouTube restricts things, but what happened was that YouTube demonetized this channel, so I can't make anything through this. So I've given up on monetization because essentially they're refusing it to me. And after I gave up on the monetization, essentially they stopped trying to restrict the videos then. So if I need to branch out into Odyssey and Rumble, I have the means to do so. At the moment, I don't see the need for it because nobody was watching those platforms. Right. And if you want to support the program, go to the Patreon page, essentially. That's the best way to do so. Jenny says, Israeli press is saying that the IDF claim to have found Chinese weapons being used in Gaza. Funny this fake story comes out after China begins to restrict some trade. We'll talk about a self-own. So they're now saying basically that the Chinese have turned on them. Great stuff. Their propaganda has just basically owned themselves. Anyone, says Jenny, dumb enough to believe a single word the Israeli government says should be locked up. There are dangers to themselves and others. Very true. President Jesus says good morning from LA. Good morning to you. Jerry says the young woman hostage commented that to arm wrestle with one of those holding her, he insisted on covering his hand with a towel as she was not a close relative. Yeah, doesn't exactly say rapist, does it? Yu Wan says, Happy New Year to you, Alex, and all comrades. Also wanted to ask about a good resource on history of complicity of the West in adoption of Nazism in Ukraine and other Warsaw Pact countries. I'll need to take that away and look at it. There are some resources, but I will post those in the Telegram channel at some point. Okay. So, bringing this to a close for this afternoon. Thank everybody for joining the stream. If you haven't liked and shared it already, be sure to do so. I'll thank everybody who's watched and listened to the content I've produced over the course of the last year. It's been another year where the channel has changed and grown. I only started doing this YouTube stuff again in the middle of the year in response to the Prigozhin coup, if you remember him. There's a man whose rise and fall was rather spectacular. But the channel's grown, and thank you to everybody who regularly tunes in. Thank you to everybody who has liked and shared the work, and thank you to everybody who supports the program on Patreon. I couldn't do the work that I do without your contributions, so special thanks to everybody who does so. In 2024, I will continue to do YouTube broadcasts. I'll try and do it at least 5 nights a week if I possibly can. And we have a lot of stuff to talk about. And I'm proud to play a part in any small way that I can in the rebuilding of the communist movement across the imperialist nations. I hope to play an active part in that with comrades in the coming year. But for now, I will say thank you to everybody who has tuned in over the course of the last year. Much more to come from me in the year to come. And I will leave you with a musical interlude and a reminder that the great only appear great because you are on your knees. Get off your knees and they appear as the midgets that they are. Thank you to everybody for tuning in, and I will say Happy New Year to you all, and I'll see you again tomorrow in the new year.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a